Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you, Colgate students, faculty, alums, and friends. I'm Stanley Brubaker, a professor of political science here at Colgate University. It's great to see you virtually, and really delighted to have you join us to explore a pretty dark, disquieting topic. Few things darken the horizon of democracy or the academy than the rise of cancel culture, a spirit of intolerance and unwillingness to hear the other side out, a willingness to assume the worst of the other side. So we are especially grateful to the Center for Freedom and Western Civilization under the able direction of Carolyn Guile, professor of art and art history, and Robert Kranek, professor of political science, for sponsoring this afternoon's events, and more generally, for keeping free speech alive as well as lively at Colgate. Our special guest this afternoon is Jonathan Turley, who is the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Professor of Law at George Washington University, the youngest recipient of a chaired position at that institution. He's one of the country's foremost scholars of constitutional law. He's astonishingly prolific at this. He's published in all of the major law reviews, as well as the nation's leading dailies, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. He's just completed a three-part study of the historical and constitutional evolution of civilian and military relations in America. And people read what he writes. In fact, he is one of the two most frequently cited legal authorities in the country. And his advice has been sought by judges, justices, cabinet officials, members of the House and the Senate, to which he's given testimony concerning war powers, nominations to the Supreme Court, cabinet positions, and on and on. He's a frequent guest on American talk shows, Dateline, CBS, NBC News, and Sunday talk shows, and so forth. He's also a skilled practitioner of the law. He's representing high-profile whistleblowers and some of the other unsavory sort of characters that who really require representation, terrorists, drug runners, members of Congress, and an impeached judge in a Senate trial. He's very hard to pigeonhole. People think he's a Democrat or a Republican. If they're one side or the other, they tend to define him as the other. But he is a very lucid and fiercely independent thinker and a consistent defender of the First Amendment. So we are honored to have him here as our guest this afternoon. He's going to talk about the anti-free speech movement in America from the Alien and Sedition Acts to the Anti-Fascism. So our format is going to be simple. He will give his address, and then you can weigh in your questions. You can wait until he's finished to hear all of what he said, or if questions occur to you as he's speaking, you can go into that little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. So please join me as you can in welcoming Professor Turley. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brubaker. Thank you very much to Colgate for having me. Unfortunately, when Professor Brubaker was looking for someone for a dark and dispiriting subject, they came directly to me, since I've cornered the market on both of those subjects. Actually, it is a bit depressing to be a free speech advocate during this period. I am a dinosaur, and I readily admit that. I fall under that classic liberalism view of free speech. I don't actually accept many limits on free speech, and that has labeled me as something of an absolutist in the teaching academy. I've defended people on the far left and people on the far right, because I really don't care about what people say as much as their right to say it. And that makes this a rather perilous time because we are living through a period where free speech has fallen out of favor in the West. We've fallen out of love with it. It has suddenly gone from the thing that defines us to a threat, to something we are trying to preserve. And the results are chilling. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the origins of this sort of struggle with free speech. We often talk a good game about free speech, but our history is a rather checkered one. And so, like most subjects, legal subjects, we begin in England. Most of this discussion begins with the Magna Carta and the sort of foundations for basic rights. I wouldn't include the Magna Carta in that list, by the way. It was an ironic moment. I was asked to speak in London at the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, where the Queen and others were celebrating this great document. Nobody bothered to actually check out my writings because I've been a critic of the Magna Carta for years. So it was a really odd thing for me to get that invitation. The reason I've been critical of Magna Carta is because it was a colossal failure repeatedly. It was ignored by the Crown. And more importantly, it really didn't protect most of the rights that define us today. And people make assumptions about the Magna Carta. Of course, we say the Magna Carta in the United States. Before my speech, various English jurists and legislators came up and said, I hope you will be using just Magna Carta, not the Magna Carta like you Yanks do. So I went out of my way to say the Magna Carta every time chance I did. Yeah. I felt it was character building for my English colleagues. The most interesting thing about our close cousins in England is that they never really did have a strong foundation for free speech. In England, free speech was originally a privilege. It still is. Many of the rights in England are guaranteed more by a benign government than an express guarantee. And that is clear in many of the decisions on free speech. John Holt made this clear in 1704 when he virtually mocked the concept that people with an ill opinion of the government actually had a right to say it. The Chief Justice said, for it's very necessary for all governments that the people should have a good opinion of it. So you can see there's a fundamental difference in the concept of free speech in England. And the reason this is interesting for us is that we took so much from England in terms of traditions. But when it came to free speech, it was one of those areas where we really did cut our own trail in a way that advanced civil liberties in this world in a way that was unprecedented. But the result of speech being a privilege is really bearing fruit today in Europe. In Europe, free speech is in a free fall. Various laws criminalizing free speech have been expanding. It creates an insatiable appetite once people can silence others instead of just responding to them. So the definition of a hate crime has grown wider and wider. You know, Barry Thu was a guy who wore an anti-police t-shirt. Home Secretary Rudd was subject to an investigation for criticizing foreign workers taking jobs. A teenager was detained for saying Scientology is not a religion, a cult. All of these things in the United States would be core protected speech. But across Europe, particularly in England, Germany, and France, the rate of criminalization of speech is breathtaking. And as we feared in the United States, once they abandoned the bright line rule of free speech as a value in and of itself, they found themselves on the slippery slope of censorship and criminalization. And the result is a chilling effect on free speech. And that is really evident in polls like this one in Germany, where only 18% of Germans feel free to express their views in public. 18%. 31% of Germans did not feel free to express their views among friends. That's the effect of what we call the chilling effect on free speech. So in the United States, we were fortunate to have characters like Thomas Paine, who is often overlooked in our intellectual discussions of free speech. But Thomas Paine was important not just because he was a really excellent writer, he was also a real pain. No one liked him. I don't think Thomas Paine liked Thomas Paine. He would drink heavily. He would get into fights. He loved to insult people. He was everything I love about a human being. He also became not just an articulation of free speech, he became the reason for free speech, because it didn't take long to know Thomas Paine when you wanted to arrest him. Thomas Paine drew the ire of people like John Adams, who despised him and called common sense a crapulous mass, which frankly is a wonderful term that we should all use more often. And it was interesting that it was Adams, as we're going to get to in a second, who expressed this hatred for Thomas Paine. As we see, Adams did not take long in taking such feelings and putting them in terms of legislation. By the way, Thomas Paine went to France and they adored him when he arrived as the American revolutionary figure that he was. It only took a relatively brief time before they sought his arrest and decapitation. Because of course, the first thing Thomas Paine did was to say, wow, all of you are incredibly corrupt and dishonest. And once again, that's why some of us love Thomas Paine. Now, the interesting thing about the United States then is how the heck did we end up with the First Amendment when you had people like John Adams, who seemed to like free speech in the abstract, and our close cousins, the English, didn't even view it as a right as much as a privilege. And yet, look at these words. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Wow. That is clear, concise, and it's an incredible reaffirmation of this basic human right of free speech. Now, Brandeis and others reminded us that free speech is sort of the thumping heart of a democratic and free society. It is vital to spreading political truth. And that means that you have to have a lot of tolerance for people that say utter nonsense, including if you think people like Thomas Paine are serving up continual amounts of crapulous mass. That led to people like Hugo Black saying something equally clear and equally concise about the meaning of those words in the First Amendment. He simply said, I take no law abridging to mean no law abridging. It may not surprise you. I relish Hugo Black's viewpoint. And a lot of difficulty that we've had in this country would have been avoided if we really took those words at their face value. But of course, this is the beginning of our rather troubling record with free speech. Many people today just assume that our political environment is unprecedented. I remember in testifying once in Congress where a member said, Professor, you talk about the framers all the time and all their intents, but they didn't live in these times. These are different times. And I said, here's a flash for you, Gordon. They didn't just live in these times. They wrote the Constitution for these times. So when you guys today talk about wanting to kill each other figuratively, they were actually trying to kill each other. They were using the Alien and Sedition Acts to actually kill each other. And so this was a period where Jefferson called the Federalists the reign of the witches. So the First Amendment was written during a period like ours. This is not some weird exotic moment. This document was designed for this moment because it was written in this moment. So you look at the Federalists predicting that a Jeffersonian administration would introduce murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. I mean, teaching incest is something that even, one is not accused the Jeffersonians of. On the Jeffersonian side, they predicted chains, dungeons, transportation, and perhaps the gibbet. That actually makes sort of packing the Supreme Court look a little bit, I don't know, understated. But that's when the First Amendment came into being. And of course, the man who wanted to denounce crapulous masses of all kind put one in legislative form in the Alien and Sedition Act. Now, these were actually 4 laws, including the Sedition Act of 1798, which made it a crime to print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writings against the government of the United States or either House of Congress of the United States or the President of the United States. I mean, just look at that language. Is there anything more offensive to an American citizen than that language? That's the whole purpose of free speech, is to say malicious things about our politicians, about our government. And this is really John Adams conveying the view of the English system of speech as a privilege. Remember the Chief Lord saying that no government could exist if you allowed people to say terrible things about it. Well, John Adams tried to make this country much like that in an absolutely horrific set of laws. And so people that were prosecuted most famously was James Callender. He was called a scandal monger. He was a scandal monger. He was sort of vicious. He's also a pretty good writer. He did write a lot about reforms and things like that. He was an associate with Jefferson, and Jefferson talked a good game about John Adams being a sort of a corrupting and an abusive element. But Jefferson did not have clean hands either. He was pretty vicious when it came to the Federalists. So were his supporters. And the word is that he enlisted Callender to attack Adams, which Callender did as a repulsive, penitent, gross hypocrite and unprincipled oppressor. Quite frankly, given the Alien and Sedition Acts, those were not necessarily hyperbole or hyperbolic. Like Thomas Paine, he lived a very unhappy life because he was a sort of a dissenting view wherever he went. He ended up drowning in 3 feet of water when he fell intoxicated face down. It sort of gives you an idea of the gentleman's lifestyle. You also had Lyon, who was actually a member of Congress, who had the distinction, by the way, of representing districts from Vermont and Kentucky at different times. He also had the distinction of being in jail and being reelected. He was in jail because of the Sedition Acts, because he spoke out against President Adams. This is an example of how far and outrageous these acts were. Jefferson ultimately pardoned people convicted. A large number of people were convicted. And the Alien Sedition Acts died with the end of the Adams administration. It was never, however, found to be unconstitutional. Instead, it simply died a natural death. Jefferson warned against, quote, new pretexts for those who wish it to be believed that man cannot be governed but by the rod of iron. And when it came to free speech, Jefferson was much better than Adams. It's just that when it came to vicious political attacks, they were cut from the same bolt. I'm speaking, of course, as a Madisonian scholar, just to remind you that there's only one James Madison, and he's the only framer that looks as good close up as he does far away. So the United States continued to struggle with free speech One of the worst periods, of course, was the first Red Scare. It's a shame. It's like world wars that we have to number them. But this occurred between 1917, 1920. Anarchists and socialists were particularly the focus. Attorney General Gregory said, "May God have mercy on them, for they need expect none from an outraged people and an avenging government." I mean, wow, an avenging government. We're going to attack people who hold socialist or anarchist views. 1 year later, his successor, Mitchell Palmer, led the notorious Palmer raids, where communists and socialists and anarchists were rounded up, thousands of them, for their views. During this period, you had the Schenck case, where Oliver Wendell Holmes said the most regrettable words ever uttered by a Supreme Court justice, and that is, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic. No line has been more misrepresented and more misused than that one. I was asked in one of the classes today if I could go back in time and change certain things, what would it be? And one of those stops in my Wayback Machine would be in 1919 to go into Oliver Wendell Holmes and actually scratch that line out and tell him that, you know, you will regret this, because he did regret it. He actually later had sort of buyer's remorse about that line. By the way, the decisions in the Schenck case were outrageous. This was prosecuting someone for defying the draft. And later in Abrams, Holmes started to move away from that standard and concurred with Brandeis and Whitney, and they ultimately rejected the standard in Brandenburg. And yet the quote is still widely used. And we also, you know, during that period, you know, the person that ran for president as a socialist was convicted for purely political speech in one of the most outrageous cases, obviously, in history for free speech. Now, many people have mocked this. Abby Hoffman said, free speech means the right to shout theater in a crowded fire. And A.B. Hoffman and what happened in the 60s certainly tested our commitment to free speech. But from 47 to 57, we had the second Red Scare, the Un-American Activities Committees, and targeting artists, writers, producers. One of the things I want to note about that is that this was a period of blacklisting by private entities. And so in the 50s, we saw the use of companies and universities to blacklist people with dissenting views. And that was popular. It was popular. And today we're seeing the same thing. But today it is flipped, where we see many people on the left effectively blacklisting people with dissenting views on the right. So today we have people who actually have expressed false ideas. You know, we've had a number of members of Congress and politicians who have said that hate speech is not constitutionally protected. People like Howard Dean have said that. Hate speech is protected in the United States. There are some forms of speech that can be criminalized under Brandenburg. But we've seen already this sort of move towards a European model. You know, after a circus clown dressed as Barack Obama at a rodeo, local officials demanded a prosecution as a hate crime. 2 women were charged in 2017 for burning signs of Donald Trump. You can burn the American flag, that's protected. You should be able to burn signs of Donald Trump. But it shows how this desire to silence others lives like a dormant virus in our system that comes to the front throughout our history. We see that with the internet. Today, politicians are openly calling for censorship on the internet. The Hunter Biden story is a good example of that. There's a fair criticism that one can make that the Hunter Biden story is not necessarily, indicting or incriminating for Joe Biden. There's a good faith reason for questioning aspects of the story, but it is a story and a valid one. You can just disagree on how important it is. When that story was blocked, the companies, Twitter and Facebook, later agreed that it was not, there is no evidence it's Russian disinformation. The FBI has reached that conclusion. Nobody who's looked at this material has said that these are fake emails or this was not his laptop, including the Biden campaign. Now, that doesn't mean that this is a story that is the October surprise. It doesn't mean you have to accept the criticism. But these companies admitted they erred in blocking access to that story. They did that this week. They agreed that the story should not have been blocked. Now, there is a question of blocking some of the material that has personal information on it. But in terms of blocking the story itself, it was agreed that this was sort of an automatic response. What was chilling this week is how many members of the Senate demanded more censorship of this area. We also had the recent controversy of the New York Times apologizing for publishing a column by Senator Tom Cotton, who was referring to the history of the use of the military to quell violent riots. That column was controversial, and I disagreed with it. But it was accurate historically, it's just I disagree with the policy. But the opinion editor was fired, and they apologized for running this column. And then recently they ran a column by the Hong Kong official called Beijing's enforcer in Hong Kong, who dismissed protesters fighting for freedom and defended the crackdown on those protesters. Worse yet, we've had academics like Harvard Law professor Jack Goldsmith, who recently said that China was right and that we need to censor the internet, that they were right all along. Now, what I've argued is I prefer Mill to Mao. That for Mill, the question is the harm principle and whether, in his view, the government's legitimate right in restraining your conduct, your activities, is to protect others from harm. But he expressly said that doesn't include harm that just comes from your identity, your values, your ideas. He's talking about real harm. He anticipated that people would say that, well, your very existence is harmful to me. And of course, that's what we're seeing on college campuses, this argument that anyone stating opposing views are actually harming me. It's sort of the hijacking of the harm principle to make it into a vehicle of actual censorship. And that leads us to free speech on campus, which is a big concern that I have. Polls show that college students are falling out of love with free speech. 40% of millennials favor speech codes today. When I went to college, when I was at the University of Chicago, I doubt you could have gotten 5% of the students to support restrictions on free speech. I mean, at U Chicago, we had everything from Trotskyites to fascists, and yet we loved the fact that there was such diversity. It was a wild place. You could hear really different views. I remember I actually lived in a vegetarian cooperative, the same place where the book The Jungle was written. And I remember we had a group of Trotskyites that would meet in our basement and would beg me to come down because they needed 5 people in order to stay a club at the University of Chicago. So I would be dragged down there to give them a fifth, and I would just listen to this utter Trotskyite nonsense. But I loved it. I actually loved it. I loved being in a place where 4 people could get together and espouse these views. We've lost that. We seem to have a generation rising that believes free speech is itself a danger. You have people like Professor Franks, who actually says that the problem with this is that the internet, which is the greatest single invention of free speech in the history of humanity, needs to look more like college campuses and engage in more censorship, because the future should be these speech codes and restrictions on harmful speech. And so today we have these vague speech codes. Penn State says that it's a violation to taunt, ridicule, or insult others. No definition, just if you say something insulting, you can be subject to a violation. Places like UCLA says that you cannot create intimidating, hostile, or offensive environments. That is, create an environment. So it's not even a direct statement. If your statement is creating this vaguely undefined, this vague and undefined hostile environment. Texas A&M says you cannot show disrespect for personal feelings, or the freedom from indignity of any type is protected. What does that mean? I mean, I'm a lawyer, and for free speech, we need bright lines. It's not that free speech advocates believe that you should attack the dignity of individuals. It's just that free speech only lives within a bright line rule. Rhode Island College states that it will not only punish actions, but attitudes. Harassment is defined at Jackson State as any behavior, and this is a common definition, that places another member in a state of fear or anxiety. So if I say something that makes someone anxious, not that I intended it, all of these definitions you'll notice is how information is received, not intended. And that means that you basically control the speech of others by how you subjectively feel that the speech impacts you. Courts, when they have reviewed these speech codes, have been almost uniformly critical. Federal judges have been really quite strong in saying that these speech codes are ridiculous, that they are undefined, that they are a threat to free speech. And yet these universities continue to fight for standards that the federal courts believe are the antithesis of free speech. Now you add to that new microaggression rules that make it a microaggression. And I've had debates with people on microaggressions, and I always start out the same way, saying, would you please define microaggressions? And I've yet to have a single speech where someone defined it, because microaggressions are supposed to be stuff that are not openly racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, but they are somehow lesser but have an impact. So instead, schools just give examples of things that are microaggressions and they expect you to work it out. And this creates a chilling effect, because you see things like this that are defined as microaggressions, that anyone can succeed in society if they work enough. America is the land of opportunity. I don't see skin color. Use of terms like melting pot, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. All of those things have been defined in schools as microaggressions. And so once you read examples, since there's no definition, it obviously creates a chilling effect where you don't want to say anything at all, because if these things are violations, you're not sure about what else might be a violation. And even stuff that you say outside of school, like Dean Chu at Yale left a caustic Yelp review of a restaurant, making fun of how a Japanese dish was made. She was forced to resign because it was viewed as classist. And even though this was on Yelp, she was writing as a restaurant goer, she was still forced to resign. Now we have lots of examples on both sides. You have this Drexel professor who has made comments about white genocide and wanting to vomit when he saw a soldier given a position in first class. People wanted him fired. People like myself defended him because those are his views. And the best way to respond to bad speech is more speech. The Northwestern student leaders organized a protest against a teacher who had invited one day an undocumented person and the next day a member of ICE to talk about their experiences. This seems to me a uniquely good class. It'd be very interesting to have both of those views. Students actually stopped the class from happening when they asked the ICE person in. And the students gave interviews by name in the interview, proudly saying that we don't want people with these views to be heard on campus. By the way, the Northwestern University went to them and said, you have to let this class continue, and said, what if we invite you in? Would you promise just not to disrupt the class? And they said, sure. And they invited them in and then disrupted the class and wouldn't let it go forward. All those students were identified. Not one of them was disciplined. Northwestern just simply said it was unfortunate. The class was canceled. The ICE person was not brought back. This is a direct attack on the academic freedom of this professor trying to share different views in her class. And that class was canceled quite literally. We've seen this happen with conservative speakers, people like Yiannopoulos. I have no idea what Yiannopoulos says. I've never heard a speech by Yiannopoulos. I see him referenced all the time because I don't care. I mean, I don't care about the views on the left or the right. I only care about people who want to silence others instead of responding to them. And in this case, various schools have shut down conservative speakers. This has happened even with cabinet officials have been silenced at various schools because no one wants to hear their viewpoint, or at least not no one, these students don't. Now remember, these are rooms filled with people who came to hear these views. Academics, students, alumni who came in the hundreds to be able to listen to this alternative view. They were denied that by a small number of people who, it's not that they don't just disagree, they don't want others to hear the views. And that is what is anti-free speech. The Northwestern example it shows how far this has gone in terms of denying not just free speech, but academic freedom. Recently, we had an ACLU official object that Transylvania University admitted this guy, Nick Sandman, who was falsely accused of attacking a Native American activist in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Various news organizations have settled with Sandman and apologized. It turns out that story was entirely untrue. He did not attack the activist. It was quite the opposite. And so he has received settlements. But even after all of that, the ACLU's representative in Kentucky attacked Transylvania University for allowing him to be educated at their university. And one of the professors, Professor Tompkins, responded to say that she was going to monitor his every move on campus to see if he steps out of line, because he's a conservative student. So we've gone from anti-sedition to a new anti-fascism movement, which is at base an anti-free speech movement. Antifa is the best known example of that. This is an organization that found its roots in Germany as resisting fascism, but it was also founded on an anti-free speech foundation. You can see that in the Antifa handbook, which was written by a Dartmouth law professor at the time. And it starts out tellingly with the quote, "Fascism is not to be debated, it is to be destroyed." And it goes on to talk about how one of the targets of Antifa is free speech, that free speech itself is a vehicle of oppression, of heteropatriarchy and ultra-nationalism and white supremacy. Key to Antifa is the concept of deplatforming, which we have seen in various campuses where Antifa supporters organize to keep views from being heard, not to respond to them, and to actually stop them. This is called the heckler's veto. And I had a debate at Rice University with NYU professor Jeremy Waldron, who is one of the great advocates of the European model of criminalizing speech. And he insisted that the heckler's veto is in fact free speech. That is simply not true. And other academics like the Cooney Law Dean said the same thing, that shutting down speakers is free speech. It is not free speech. I fought for free speech my whole life. No one in the free speech community that I know of believes that stopping others from speaking is free speech. No, free speech is your being able to respond, your being able to state your views. At William and Mary, the ACLU had a speaker who came to the campus to speak on free speech, and she was shut down because by protesters who said that liberalism is white supremacy, and ACLU would protect Hitler too. In other words, we don't support free speech because some people would say things we don't agree with. Other students have supported violence and hostility. The Wellesley editors said that hostility may be warranted and it's not a violation of free speech to stop speech. This Orwellian definition is catching on. In 2019, 1 in 3 students felt that violence was justified to stop people from engaging in what they deemed hate speech. 53% of college students say that they feel intimidated now in sharing their views on campus. That is more than 1 out of 2 students today don't feel they can speak freely. That is unthinkable. When I went to college, college used to be the place where you could finally think freely. You could finally be your own person. You can explore different things. Recently, a professor at the University of Rhode Island said that he saw nothing wrong with the killing of a conservative counter-protester in Portland, and said that sometimes violence is necessary. At the University of California, Santa Barbara, a feminist studies professor, Miller Young, actually led her students out of her class and criminally assaulted pro-life advocates that had a table outside supporting pro-life causes. She destroyed the sign and physically assaulted one of the protesters. She pled guilty to the crime of assault. And the faculty and students rallied around her. She wasn't fired, she was lionized. She was honored in other universities for her activism. Now, it's been a long time since I got tenure, but I vaguely remember that among the things that we were not supposed to do was physically attack students. And so here you have someone who criminally assaulted people on campus, and the university didn't fire her, did not discipline her, and thousands of faculty and students rallied around her. And many of them signed a statement that it was the pro-life people that were the fault. They were described as terrorists for arguing for pro-life, and said that they triggered this response. Recently, Harvard professor Steven Pinker wrote about police shootings. He actually said that he believed there's racism in policing in America, but he was simply saying something that's appeared in academic journals about the rate of police shooting in the United States, and suggesting that that may be due not to systemic racism, because the majority are not Black, but more importantly to the fact that we use force too often in the United States. So his theory was that we have to train officers not to use force as they do in European countries, that the problem is that they rely on force too much in the United States. Now, you can certainly disagree with that view, and many of my friends do, but instead people want him fired, and the reason is he engaged in what's called both sides rhetoric. So by giving both sides of that issue, he was declared a racist, and they are seeking for him to be fired. And by the way, some professors who have said dissenting views have not only been fired, some of them have had to get police protection in their homes because they have questioned some of these assertions about, police shootings or systemic racism, etc. It also extends to students. In Georgetown, a columnist was recently singled out by the entire Senate student senate body and denounced, because he wrote a column entitled A Nation of Virtuous Individuals, where he questioned some of the accusations being made in protests and some of the causes in protests. The Senate called for formal charges of bias because the vocabulary of this article invalidates the experience of BIPOC individuals in and outside the Georgetown community, and stated that the United States of America is not systemically racist today. That was the line that they isolated as a basis for his discipline. And what I wrote at the time is Georgetown University didn't say a thing. So a student was being singled out by the student government because he had an opposing view in a column that didn't even appear on Georgetown University property. And the university didn't say a bloody thing about needing to guarantee the protection of free speech. At the University of Wisconsin, a columnist was recently fired because he wrote that he didn't believe we should defund police. And the editor said, well, that's too much of a hot take and we don't want a backlash. And so they fired him because he dared to they didn't publish his column to write on that subject. So let me end with this. Recently at George Washington University, one of our own students, Jason Charter, who has been associated with Antifa for years, was arrested as one of the leaders tearing down statues in Washington. And he said something that I thought was interesting after his arrest. He said, the movement is winning. And he's right. We are living in the most successful anti-free speech movement in the history of this country because it has penetrated our universities and our streets. I've never seen so much fear among academics, among columnists, among journalists, that they cannot give dissenting views. You know, I remember there was a writer in the French Revolution who was asked, he actually supported the French Revolution, then became a critic, and he was asked at the end, what did you do during the reign of terror? And he said, I survived. And the point is, we can't just survive. Many academics are being silenced. And if we don't speak up now, rights don't come back. They're like a gas. If you let them go, they will dissipate and they will disappear. And so it takes all of us on both sides to support those we disagree with and to stand with them despite our disagreements, not for what they say, but for the right to say it. Why don't I stop there? I think that I'm getting the signal that I'm over time.
No, that was great, a very powerful presentation. I'd like to open it up to our audience out there to type in questions down at the bottom of your toolbar where it says Q&A. So I don't have one yet on my Q&A box here. So let me begin with one for you, sir. And that is to distinguish between government censorship of speech and private corporations and individuals and so on, where you seem to have blurred the line a little bit, because it's a much trickier constitutional issue to say that you're violating the First Amendment because it says Congress shall make no law, which generally means governments can't censor or control. But, you know, with these issues with Twitter and Facebook and so on, is a much trickier thing because they're private entities. And so would you address that question? And universities are half private and half public, so the First Amendment applies to public universities, not necessarily to private ones. And so it's a much trickier issue with private entities. So I would like you to address that from a legal, constitutional, and then social point of view.
Yeah, thank you. It's an excellent question. I actually have slides on that. I cut them out because we have limited time. So there's three issues there that I'd like to unpack. First, you're absolutely correct, of course, that the First Amendment applies to government action and government censorship. But the one thing that I often note is that when we talk about free speech, we're not just talking about the First Amendment. We're talking about the value of free speech. We're talking about the protection of free speech as a human right. And that's what it is. that human beings need to be able to speak freely. They need to be able to give their values, to associate with others. Second, what is sometimes called the little brother problem, to distinguish it from the big brother problem, is in fact our biggest problem. There is more speech controls being exercised by private universities and by private companies. The New York Times is a good example of that with its mea culpa, but also universities are now actively engaging in speech codes and regulations. Those actions are still violations of free speech. It's just that the First Amendment does not necessarily apply. When it comes to the internet, that is the most worrisome of all. I was raised in a very liberal democratic family, and I don't know when the Democratic Party became a party for censorship, but this week, various Democratic senators told the internet companies, we want more censorship and not less. And I was floored as a free speech advocate, because governments like China and Iran have worked for years to restrict the internet because it's a threat to tyranny. It's a threat to these countries. And we're radically embracing it. Now, finally, as the point of blurring the line, it does become a government issue for the internet because of Section 230. And Section 230 does give immunity to these companies. And I've long supported 230 because I want immunity if it guarantees free speech. The problem is what Twitter and Facebook did on things like the Hunter Biden story is wrong. It's wrong. I mean, they were interfering with people learning about a story which was true. It does appear it's true. It does appear to be his laptop. It does appear that these are legitimate emails. And that is really the greatest fear, that internet companies will use the immunity to protect themselves while exercising in a biased way. And so that 230 debate is still occurring, but the problem is, from to this week's hearing, it was clearly conveyed by the Democrats that they want more censorship, and presumably if they get it, they will retain 230.
Okay, so I have some questions now one is from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for an amazing speech. Do you have any advice for students with unpopular views who are afraid to make their opinions known on campus? How can we help the free speech movement in such an unfriendly environment?
This is one of the most difficult things that I'm asked when I speak on campuses, because what I'm about to say is not easy. We have no choice but to speak. And that means that people will come after you. They've come after me, they've come after many academics. But free speech dies in silence. And it's like a muscle. If you don't use it, it atrophies and you lose it. But also, life is not like a sort of monopoly game. You go around as many times as you want. Live your life. State your views. Fight for the values you want. It's not going to be easy. It never has been in history. Those people who are trying to silence you are picking what Morrison called those ancient masks and putting it on of censorship and intimidation. You're fighting the same fight that has been fought in this country since the 1700s. And it wasn't popular then, it's not popular now. You have a right to speak. Those of us still out there will defend you. But we don't have a choice. We don't have a choice but to speak. The chilling aspect is that so many faculty have been silenced. I hear from them all the time. They're afraid. They're afraid to be accused of racism or accused of intolerance. And you can't be afraid. If you want to make this world into a better place, you have to stand up and you have to speak.
Okay, another question from Stephanie Miner, who is actually visiting professor here at Colgate, former mayor of Syracuse, asks, how do you balance the issues of free speech with public safety, like with Governor Whitman's plot, meaning the plot against her? I mean, would you address the security versus liberty argument?
Yeah, first of all, like Benjamin Franklin, I don't accept that dichotomy. Free speech is not the reason Whitmer was the subject of a criminal conspiracy, and we did deal with it. We arrested them. That's what you do with criminals. I don't go down the slippery slope of treating speech as conduct. I've never agreed with Brandenburg. the Supreme Court decision. I think speech is speech.
Could you explain that to the public, please?
Well, Brandenburg the Supreme Court in Brandenburg said that you generally cannot criminalize free speech, but you can criminalize it if it's threatening imminent violence, which they left rather undefined. And that has not led to a lot of limitations on free speech, but I currently represent someone, a Muslim academic who was prosecuted for violent speech. And that case has been going on for almost 15 years now. I don't agree that speech is like conduct. You prosecute conduct. If you actually have a conspiracy, yes, that's speech, but you're engaged in planning for an attack like the one against Whitmer, and those people were arrested. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about at universities are speech codes and other ways of stopping people from speaking. Anyone who engages in a criminal conspiracy is a criminal, and we've never had any trouble prosecuting those people.
Mm-hmm. So a conspiracy is an action, not a speech. Anonymous question, how do you balance censorship versus the legitimate removal of false information intended to mislead others?
Yeah, see, this is, I'm afraid I'm a broken record on this. These are, the fake news and disinformation are terms that have been used for many years in places like China, Iran, other countries. It's easy to call things fake news or disinformation as an excuse to regulate them. And then you find yourself on the same slippery slope as you have in Europe. The best way to deal with misinformation is better information. But once you start down this road, you really get into serious trouble. Joe Biden recently demanded that the internet companies stop any statements from Trump or others criticizing mail-in voting as an excuse for fraud. That's political speech. But of course, for many people, it is a false narrative. I get that, and I probably agree with that. But once you start to give yourself license to stop others from saying things that are false or fake, then you're just basically redefining censorship in a more pleasing image. You can fight false statements by giving true statements. Now, it's true, some people won't believe you. That's called free speech. That's called a robust and free society.
A question from Brian Horry. Are there lessons from past eras of speech suppression on how the tide was turned? Which tactics in the past of free speech advocates proved successful?
That's a wonderful question. The interesting thing is, until recently, I felt that the arc of free speech, to paraphrase Martin Luther King's statement, was bending towards greater free speech. Because I thought we'd all learned from the blacklisting period of the second Red Scare, when so many liberal writers, socialist writers, dissenting voices were kept from teaching, writing, thrown out from businesses. But it turns out now that the lessons seem to be curiously the inverse, that you can do this if you have a majority of people behind it. So now you have conservative scholars who I don't happen to agree with, being tossed from faculties, you have conservative columnists that are being fired left and right. They're leaving newspapers. Some of the leading conservative columnists who are told that their views are now intolerable. And so this is exactly what happened in the Red Scare. It's just that it's flipped. And what I'm waiting for is for people to recognize that just because they can use these powers doesn't mean they should. And there is no difference between the blacklisting of a socialist writer or academic in the 1950s and the blacklisting of a conservative professor today for criticizing socialists.
But a follow-up question on that. Should you do deliberately provocative things like in France and post cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad just to make a point about free speech, knowing that it might actually lead to violence and repercussions? Is that a successful strategy that they're pursuing in France, Charlie Hebdo, of really tapping the hornet's nest?
Well, once again, I resist that type of narrative because you're blaming people for exercising free speech. You should say that. You go on and you criticize the publication of that cartoon, but it is protected. And one of the great, France is one of the most hypocritical nations on earth on free speech. After the massacre at that magazine, there was a march by the French president and all of the European leaders, including Erdogan in Turkey, one of the most oppressive figures in the world. And they marched in support of this magazine. Every one of those leaders have cracked down on writers and speakers in their countries, including France. And one of the only surviving editors of that magazine refused to join the march because he said it made him want to throw up, because the French president had led years of a crusade against the magazine. So if you're asking me to condemn them for publishing a cartoon, I'm afraid you've come to the wrong place. They have a right to publish what they want. It is, you shouldn't be curtailing free speech because how people will respond to it. Decapitating people is a crime. And yes, we can all criticize the magazine for a gratuitous insult of religion, but don't start to engage in this type of relativism that somehow they're to blame because others find it intolerable to have a picture of Muhammad.
Okay. Question for Serenity McCracken. In the past, it seems that the violation could literally mean being put to death. What do you think contributes to the fear of free expression today when consequences seem to be more economic and social? I'm thinking of the cancel culture and the way it affects people. What do you think the root of the intimidation today is if it's not literally putting people to death?
No, it's social death and professional death. That is, what's happening is that for academics, for example, very few academics are willing now to write dissenting views because they're afraid of a petition to fire them. And even though it won't succeed, if they ever try to go to another school, people will say, oh, well, they tried to get this person fired because he was accused of being a racist. These groups understand that when you accuse a student or a faculty member of being a racist, it labels them, it poisons the water for their careers. And that's why it is so hard for students to be able to stand up. That's why so many are engaging in self-censorship. And so it has a huge impact now, socially and professionally. And it does because universities have been cowards. Universities and colleges are not protecting free speech. There are universities like Georgetown that watch a student columnist being subjected to this student government resolution, denounced as a racist for simply saying that he didn't think you should defund police or some other dissenting view, and not uttering a word that we should have a community of tolerance where these types of views are responded to, not attacking the individual because he holds them.
Do we have time for a few more questions, folks? I do have a few more here. How are you doing, Jonathan?
Oh, great.
Okay. So someone asked, this is an anonymous person from the Heather McDonald visit at campus. We had Heather McDonald speak here on our campus who stated that rape, sexual assault on college campuses doesn't exist, but there is clear evidence against this. Do you think these people should still be able to speak freely and even further have platforms where they are able to do so?
Well, first of all, any question that says, do you think these people should still be allowed to speak freely? I'm going to answer yes to. That you just showed free speech by saying that Heather McDonald is wrong. That is the exercise of free speech. That is your prerogative. And many people think she is wrong. But instead of just responding, the question somehow is, should she be prevented from speaking? That's a quantum shift. It's a dangerous type of practice to say, because I think that what she says is false, I don't think she should be able to say it. I don't think other people should be able to hear it. That is the voice of censorship. And it becomes an insatiable appetite. You start with someone like Heather McDonald, and then you work to other people who you also disagree with. History has shown where that leads. It is not a good place.
A final question, I guess, a technical question from a student about Section 230, which you spoke of in, I guess it was the corporate charter of what, Twitter or Facebook?
No, it's a federal law. It's under.
Oh, it's a federal law, excuse me. Okay. Do you think Section 230 should be modified? And if so, what changes should be made?
See, that's the problem. I got to tell you, I'm right on the fence on this one because I like the concept of immunity. If these forums would simply remain neutral, because when Twitter comes in and says, we're going to stop this or puts a flag, it's like the telephone company, right? Coming in to your phone call and saying, you know what, we've been listening. We don't like what the two of you are saying. I mean, Twitter has people who sign up to hear the views of other people. And then the company comes in and says, you know, I don't like the way this is going, or you need to check on this. We don't need Twitter to do that. We don't need Facebook to do that. We can do it. We've never had a problem calling out false and boorish and discriminating language. And so I would prefer to keep 230, but what I saw this week was wholly unapologetic companies. And they're getting a lot of support for engaging in greater censorship. And it's satisfying, right? People that hate Trump, that hate these different views, you like it because you're silencing people and you don't have to hear them. And in an age of echo journalism, where people just listen to one news station, read one newspaper, there's nothing more satisfying than keeping other people silent. But eventually, you may find that silence spreads, and maybe people will find your views disinformation or false.
Well, thank you very much. I think Professor Brubaker and perhaps Professor Guile would like to make a closing statement. Stan?
Yeah, sure. I just want to thank you so much for coming here and thank our audience. And that was really a powerful and inspiring case against the crapulous case for censorship. So I wish we could be here to applaud, but thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Carolyn?
Yes, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you very much everyone for attending, and thank you Professor Turley for this unflinching and insightful examination of some of the biggest questions that are on our minds right now. I hope that the students got a lot out of this and continue to be unafraid to express themselves in class.
And to our audience out there, thanks for attending this event by Colgate Center for Freedom and Western Civilization. And we will have future events to which you are very welcome. Okay, good evening, everyone. Wonderful. Good night.
Good night.